And so in 2017, Matt Hale led the charge to get a bill presuming that equal parenting time was in the best interest of children during temporary orders. And that passed the legislature with no negative votes, not a single negative vote in the House or the Senate. Right. Kentucky is a Republican state, but there are Democrats in both chambers of the legislature. There were no negative votes at all. It was such a popular law. It made so much sense to Kentuckians that the next year they came back with a bill for a presumption of equal custody in permanent orders, and that passed with only 2 negative votes in the legislature. And I should say, one of the negative votes came from a person who chose not to run in the next election, and the other negative vote came from a person who had won multiple elections before and lost her election to a challenger. Now, it's hard to trace down the causes of an individual loss, but I can tell you that Matt Hale thinks that the opposition to shared parenting actually hurt that legislator in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So the strategy was to first go for temporary orders and then for permanent orders. But in Arkansas, they did it all in one step. They got a very good shared parenting bill. It went through with bipartisan support and overwhelming support in the legislature. And they did it in a single step. One of the things that's important for people to know is you don't have to amass an army of people to get legislation moving. You need a group of people who are willing to dedicate some time and effort, willing to talk to legislators. It's highly desirable to find someone who has expertise in this area. In Kentucky, they were fortunate to have a professor there at the University of Louisville, then at the University of Louisville, Ryan Schroeder, who could testify about the value of shared parenting for children. So that's another important tool in trying to move shared parenting legislation.
Yes. Well, thank you for that story. It's very good to hear how you did it, and so that we can hopefully share this message with other people in provinces and states where they're hoping to do the same thing. In Kentucky, I just want to stay on that story for a minute, because after the law was passed, you were mentioning to me, and I saw a news report as well, that a few things happened as a result of that. One is that the family court caseloads have gone down because fewer people are having to go, into court to fight to keep their children, to keep custody, and domestic violence filings have also gone down, despite the fact that the population is going up in that state. They're seeing less domestic violence and less family court battles. So do you want to tell us about what happened there?
Absolutely, and I'll show you some data. It's interesting because you'll often hear attorneys and judges complain about how parents are fighting, or these parents are fighting one another, and they never acknowledge, they never admit that the system really sets it up for parents to fight against one another. It's like, throwing people into a death match and then saying they're fighting against one another. The system creates that conflict. And interestingly, the polling that I showed you before, one of the questions that we have been asking in recent years is, when there's conflict between the parents, do you think that an award of sole custody increases the conflict, decreases the conflict, or has no effect? And consistently, over 75% of people say they think it increases the conflict. When an involved, loving parent is faced with the threat of losing the relationship that's most valuable to him or her with the children, of course they're going to fight. So when you take that out of the mix, when in effect you say to people, look, you're both good involved parents, you're gonna share in the parenting equally. Now work it out. It's much easier to work things out. And then the question is, what's the best schedule for us given our work schedules and things like that? How do we do it? So it does reduce the conflict, and it has reduced the court load in Kentucky. And then the other thing that I mentioned earlier, that sometimes shared parenting advocates are opposed by domestic violence groups. Now, in Kentucky, they were fortunate, because there was one domestic violence group that opposed the shared parenting legislation, but another one that supported it. I think that the domestic violence group in Kentucky that supported it has the view that's better supported by the evidence following this. So just to share my screen one more time, these are the data for 3 years on the number of contested divorce cases and the number of domestic violence cases in Kentucky. And you'll see that 2018, 2019, and 2020, they've consistently gone down. And these data come directly from it's the Kentucky Court's analytic website. I've got the link here, and it's available on our webpage as well. So here's what I think is going on, Warren. When you remove one of the major sources of conflict, you're likely to have less domestic violence arising. I never make any excuse for domestic violence. It's a horrible thing when it happens. But sometimes people are driven to become violent because they find what they really care about is threatened. And that's not the right way to deal with it, but there are people who do that. And when you take away one of the major sources of conflict, you reduce the provocation to violence.